I still remember the day I turned onto Applewood Drive in the Meadow Glenn subdivision. Crisp sunlight bathed the neat rows of houses, each with trimmed lawns and symmetrical flower beds. It was early spring, and the delicate petals of magnolia trees drifted lazily across sidewalks. My real estate agent, Martin, pointed to a comfortable two-story home with a wide front porch. "There it is," he announced cheerfully. "The neighborhood's a bit strict with rules, but it's a lovely place. People take pride in their yards here." I'd just accepted a new job in the area, and Meadow Glen looked perfect. Quiet streets, a friendly vibe, everything a suburban dream promised. At the time, I had no inkling of the drama that would unfold. The house's most attractive feature, at least to me, was the large backyard, a spacious area that boasted dappled shade under a healthy oak and enough room for a small garden or greenhouse. In my mind, it was the ideal place to indulge my passion, bonsai cultivation. I'd nurtured bonsai trees for years, ever since discovering them in college. Each tree carried its own story, meticulously shaped over time. After touring the house, I felt that electric jolt of certainty. This was the home for me. Martin did caution me about a certain HOA board member who was hands-on with enforcing guidelines. But how bad could it be? I loved the place so much, I figured the rules would be easy to handle. It never occurred to me that someone on the board could be downright belligerent about trees, or that she might physically intrude on my property. I closed on the house in mid-April and spent the following weekend unpacking. On a bright Sunday afternoon, I decided to stroll around the neighborhood. Lining both sides of the street were manicured yards showcasing identical ornamental pear trees, apparently the official variety selected by Meadow Glen's Homeowners Association. It struck me as a bit uniform, but I brushed it off. I'd lived in HOA-governed communities before and knew they often favored consistent aesthetics. As I wandered, I noticed a figure in the distance wearing khaki capris and a floral blouse, walking with an air of authority. She held a clipboard and occasionally paused to scribble notes. Our paths converged near a mailbox painted in the same beige hue as nearly every other mailbox on the street. She locked eyes with me and offered a tight smile. "Hello, I haven't seen you before." I introduced myself. "I just moved into 1475 Applewood. My name's Eric Davis." Her gaze flicked toward my house down the street. "Oh, the Parker place. I'm Linda Bradford, head of the HOA's landscaping committee and one of the board members. Most folks call me Karen, though it's a silly nickname that stuck." She forced a chuckle that didn't quite ring true. "Nice to meet you," I said politely. I glanced at her clipboard and noticed rows of entries, yard addresses, little check marks. "Surveying the neighborhood?" She nodded briskly, always ensuring things stay up to standard. "We have guidelines to maintain a cohesive look, standard fence height, approved paint colors, landscaping, and tree requirements. I hope you'll review them if you haven't already." Her tone was friendly on the surface, but an odd tension lurked underneath, like she was assessing me for potential violations. "I have the binder," I replied. "I'm sure I'll do fine." Her bright blue eyes narrowed. "Good. We take landscaping seriously around here." She tapped the clipboard. "We're especially proud of our official tree species. Only 3 are permitted in front yards now, to keep everything consistent. Nothing kills curb appeal faster than a mismatch of random trees." I murmured something about understanding the rules. Before I could ask more, she marched off, continuing her inspection. I watched her move methodically from yard to yard, making notes, occasionally stopping to frown at a stray weed or a slightly overgrown shrub. Little did I realize she'd soon direct that same scrutiny, and more, at my bonsai. One of the first tasks I set for myself after unpacking was to bring over my bonsai trees from my previous home. They weren't numerous, maybe half a dozen, but each was a labor of love. Among them was a Japanese black pine that I'd carefully trained for nearly a decade, its trunk elegantly curved and bark showing a mature texture. I also had a rare Shishigashira maple, prized for its crinkled leaves, which had already garnered praise from fellow enthusiasts. I placed them on a sturdy wooden bench along the back fence, right where morning sunlight would greet them. The spot seemed perfect. The fence itself was tall enough to provide some wind protection, but not so tall that it blocked the light. A slight slope in the yard ensured drainage, preventing water buildup after rains. Everything felt ideal, and I found quiet joy standing there, envisioning how my backyard would transform into a mini oasis. A couple of days later, I had a neighborly visit from a man named Doug, who lived a few houses down. He saw the bonsai in my yard and came over to introduce himself, explaining he also had a mild interest in dwarf fruit trees. We chatted easily, exchanging phone numbers. As the conversation wound down, Doug lowered his voice conspiratorially. Keep an eye out for Linda. Karen, I mean. She's big on uniform landscaping, and anything that doesn't fit the cookie-cutter approach tends to rub her the wrong way. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah, I met her briefly. She seemed dedicated. Doug snorted. That's one way to put it. Don't be surprised if she tries to give you an earful about your bonsai. She'll claim some part of the yard isn't visually aligned with the HOA's preferences or something like that. I thanked him for the tip. Part of me dismissed the warning. They're just potted plants, I reasoned. Surely the HOA can't have a problem with potted plants that aren't even in the front yard. Little did I know. About 2 weeks after I settled in, the HOA released a newsletter. There, in bold letters, was a new directive. All homeowners must plant and maintain one of the official tree species in their front yard if they had removed or replaced any landscaping within the last year. The letter explained that dogwoods, ornamental pears, and flowering cherries were the only options. It was a reiteration of the existing guidelines, but with an ominous note about strict enforcement. Included with the letter was a fine schedule. Noncompliance, it stated, may result in monetary penalties of up to $250 per month. My brow furrowed. This seemed awfully heavy-handed. But the letter also proclaimed it was in the interest of preserving a harmonious neighborhood image. Typical HOA jargon. 2 days later, Linda Bradford, Karen, appeared at my front door. She offered no greeting, just held up a glossy pamphlet featuring photos of the 3 approved tree species. I wanted to make sure you got the newsletter, she said coolly. We keep track of any changes to front yard landscaping, so if you plan to plant or replace anything, it must be from this list. I hesitated, trying to remain polite. I haven't changed anything in the front yard, so I think I'm set. She waved the pamphlet. People often forget to request permission before planting. This is just a reminder. All right, thanks. She peered around me into the interior of my home, as though hoping to spot evidence of contraband shrubbery. Unsuccessful, she cleared her throat and marched off without a goodbye. After I closed the door, I leaned against it, exhaling a sigh. This woman was obviously going to be relentless about controlling the neighborhood's flora. From then on, small signs of Linda's scrutiny surfaced regularly. Once, I caught her standing in my driveway, eyeing the new bag of potting mix I'd ordered. Another time, I saw her pacing along the sidewalk, looking down the side of my house as if searching for yard violations. It was unsettling. My next-door neighbors, Jenny and Rob, confided that Linda had tried to pressure them into uprooting their hydrangea bushes, claiming they weren't an approved color. I shrugged it off, focusing on my normal life routine. Work kept me busy, but in my free time, I tended my bonsai. I always felt a sense of calm among them, meticulously watering, pruning, and fertilizing at the right intervals. My black pine, in particular, was thriving in the new environment. Then came an unexpected letter from the HOA, specifically signed by Linda. It read, "We have observed multiple potted trees in your backyard. While container plants are allowed, the overall aesthetic must align with community standards. Please ensure these plants do not clash with the uniform look of Meadow Glenn." I shook my head, baffled. The letter offered no specific instructions on how to not clash. It felt like a subtle attempt at intimidation, reminding me that the HOA was watching. I prepared a polite email in response, asking for clarification, which guidelines apply to potted trees in my private backyard, out of public view? Linda's reply was vague. "We will continue to monitor. Thank you for your compliance." Summer arrived, and the HOA announced a mandatory community tree day, where neighbors were expected to help plant new saplings in the common areas and medians. Attendance was highly encouraged. Although the subtext was clear, it was basically required. Hoping to stay on good terms, I went. About 20 residents gathered in the scorching sun, wearing gardening gloves and hats. An official landscaping company had delivered several saplings, mostly ornamental pear trees, and we spent the morning digging holes and staking them in place. Linda was there, of course, clipboard in hand, giving directions with the self-importance of a seasoned drill sergeant. She chastised people for planting a sapling a few degrees off-center, or for not mulching properly. Once, she marched over to me, frowning at the angle of the trunk I was holding. "We need them perfectly upright," she snapped. I forced a friendly smile. "I'll adjust it." She stared at me for a moment, seemingly dissatisfied with my compliance. Then, with a curt nod, she moved on. After the planting, we all stood back to admire the neat line of saplings. They looked cloned, each spaced identically, each wrapped with protective plastic sheathing. Some neighbors oohed and awed, but I couldn't help feeling stifled. Everything was so uniform, no room for personal expression. Linda made a small speech about the importance of consistent landscaping, praising the new additions. I caught her gaze flicking toward me. Could she suspect I disliked this monochromatic approach? Either way, I kept quiet, not wanting to provoke her. But I sensed the tension rising. Linda was a micromanager, and any deviation from her plan was an affront to her authority. One humid afternoon, I was working from home when I heard an odd rustling in my backyard. Thinking it might be a stray cat or a squirrel, I ignored it at first. But the noise persisted, footsteps, movement near the fence. I went to the window and peeked out, feeling a surge of annoyance when I saw Linda Bradford creeping along the edge of my yard, apparently examining my bonsai bench. I hurried outside. "Linda, is there something I can help you with?" She spun around, startled, then collected herself. "Oh, Eric. Yes, I was just checking the property line. There's a question about fence maintenance along here." I folded my arms, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "Isn't that something you'd send a letter about first? It's unusual to come unannounced into my backyard." She shrugged dismissively. "The HOA has the right to inspect for guideline compliance. Didn't you read the bylaws?" My jaw clenched. "Generally, that applies to visible exterior changes or front yard modifications, not private backyards enclosed by a fence. If there's an issue, you should notify me so I can grant access or discuss it." She said nothing, her eyes drifting to the row of bonsai. "Interesting plants," she commented coolly. "I hope none of these are invasive species." I forced a polite laugh. "They're all traditional bonsai species. None are invasive." Her gaze hovered on my prized Japanese black pine. It was the crown jewel of my collection, intricately shaped, with a trunk that told a decade-long story of patient care. She gave a subtle sniff, as if unimpressed. "Well, keep them under control. We wouldn't want them overshadowing the approved landscaping choices." I said nothing. She nodded once, then exited through the gate. A lingering sense of violation clung to me. I made a mental note to install a small camera overlooking my backyard, just in case. Something about her manner worried me deeply. Over the next month, I fell into a comfortable routine, devoting each morning to caring for the bonsai before heading to work. The little trees thrived under my watch, responding well to the climate. Meanwhile, Linda kept emailing neighborhood bulletins, often referencing proper care for the official tree species. She even circulated pictures of yards that had exemplary compliance with the HOA standards. Unsurprisingly, every singled-out yard featured identical ornamental pears or flowering cherries. Then, a neighbor I barely knew, Candace, knocked on my door one evening. She wore a nervous expression. "Sorry if this is out of the blue," she said quietly, "but I've noticed Linda poking around near people's back fences. She's fixated on any plants that aren't on the official list. I heard from Doug that you've got bonsai." I nodded. "Yes, I do." "What?" She bit her lip. "A friend of mine down the street had a decorative Japanese maple in a pot, just a normal potted plant, in her fenced backyard. Linda tried to call it a violation because it wasn't one of the HOA-approved tree species. My friend had to fight to prove that the guidelines didn't apply to potted specimens in the backyard." An uneasy feeling gripped me. I see. She was snooping in my yard recently, too, under some pretense. Candace grimaced. "Just be careful. Sometimes Linda goes to extremes, especially if she thinks you're ignoring her guidelines. I wouldn't be surprised if she tries something drastic." I thanked Candace, shutting the door with a worried sigh. Clearly, Linda believed in using intimidation to shape the neighborhood into her personal horticultural vision. But these were my bonsai, my private property. I resolved to be vigilant. One bright Saturday morning, I woke early to water and prune my bonsai as usual. I stepped outside to find the air thick and humid, the sky bright. Approaching my bench, I froze. My heart lurched. My prized black pine looked off. Branches had been clipped, sloppily, at random angles. Needles lay scattered on the ground. Whoever pruned it had no idea about proper bonsai care. It looked butchered. I rushed closer, dismay washing over me. Two other smaller bonsai also had branches cut. These cuts were not the work of a gardener. They were ragged, inexpert slices, with no sense of shaping or design. It was sabotage. For a moment, I stood trembling, anger welling up inside. Who would do this? Then, I recalled Linda's suspicious visits, her snide remarks. Could she really have trespassed at night to tidy up my trees? It sounded extreme, even for her. But given her repeated interference, who else had such a motive? Gathering my wits, I snapped photos from multiple angles, carefully documenting every cut, every branch strewn on the ground. Next, I checked the small security camera I had installed not long ago. Sure enough, the motion sensor had activated at around 5 a.m. that morning. I loaded the footage on my phone, heart pounding. The video showed a figure creeping into my yard, short, middle-aged, wearing gloves. The grainy image wasn't perfect, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Linda's body shape, her posture, her haircut. She carried a small pair of pruning shears. For about 5 minutes, she moved along my bonsai bench, snipping here and there. She seemed in a hurry, occasionally glancing around as if worried about being caught. Then she slipped away, disappearing into the early morning gloom. My outrage surged. I had proof, clear trespassing and property damage. Moreover, these weren't just ornamental shrubs. My black pine was possibly worth thousands of dollars, given its age and quality. This was no trivial matter. I wasted no time. First, I phoned the local police's non-emergency line, explaining the incident. They sent an officer, who took my statement and examined the footage. I could tell he was somewhat bemused. An HOA landscaping dispute turned quasi-criminal. But he treated it seriously enough, confirming that Linda had indeed trespassed and inflicted damage on my property. Next, I emailed the HOA board, attaching several screenshots from the video. My message was direct and formal. Ms. Bradford trespassed and pruned my bonsai without permission, causing costly damage. I request an immediate investigation and expect restitution. If the HOA fails to address this, I will pursue legal action. Then I forwarded the same evidence to an attorney friend, Kayla. She specialized in civil disputes and was appalled by the video. It's not just a violation of HOA rules, it's outright vandalism of private property, she said over the phone. We can definitely hold her accountable. Within hours, the neighborhood buzzed with the news. Doug called, breathless. I heard Linda messed with your bonsai. That's insane. It is, I replied grimly. But I've got proof, and I'm not letting this slide. The following evening, the HOA president, Mark Benson, requested a meeting with me at his home. When I arrived, Mark looked harried and stressed. Clearly, this incident had thrown the board into crisis mode. He ushered me into his living room, where a couple of other board members sat. Linda was nowhere to be seen. Mark offered me a seat. First, let me say we're sorry this happened, he began. We saw the video, and it's alarming. Linda claims she was tidying up your yard to maintain the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. But the board did not authorize her to enter your property. I leaned forward. She had no right to do that. My bonsai are personal property, not subject to front yard standards. And even if it was front yard landscaping, the HOA can't just break in and do as they please. A woman named Grace, another board member, nodded. We agree. Linda overstepped her authority in a serious way. The problem is she's insisting she had justification under the bylaws. But I've read them, and it's clear you're correct. HOA inspectors can't just trespass. Typically, they must give notice and schedule a visit, especially for backyard areas. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. We're going to hold an internal hearing. We'd like you to attend, present the footage, and let Linda respond. If she can't refute the evidence, we'll vote on a formal penalty, possibly expulsion from the board. I swallowed. Part of me wanted immediate retribution, but I also realized an official hearing was a step in the right direction. All right, I said, but I expect serious consequences for her actions. My black pine alone is worth thousands. She's done real damage. The board members exchanged solemn looks. We understand, Mark said. We'll do our due diligence. You have every right to seek compensation. Feeling a mix of satisfaction and lingering anger, I left. The hearing was scheduled for a week later. I spent the intervening days assessing the extent of the damage to my bonsai. The black pine had lost multiple branches that were integral to its shape. Repairing it, or retraining it, would take years, if it was even possible to restore. My heart hurt at the thought of losing such a beautiful specimen to mindless vandalism. Determined to be fully prepared for the upcoming hearing, I dived deep into local ordinances and state laws regarding private property and trespassing. I found a wealth of information confirming that no homeowner association rule supersedes basic property rights, especially for something enclosed in a backyard, invisible from the street. Moreover, damaging or removing personal property without consent could constitute vandalism and lead to civil liability. Kayla, my attorney friend, helped me compile these statutes into a neat, bullet-pointed document. She also suggested I appraise the black pine and the other bonsai that were pruned. If you can show the financial loss, plus the cost of restorative horticultural care, that'll strengthen your claim for restitution, Kayla said. I consulted with a local bonsai expert, Mr. Walters, who ran a nearby nursery specializing in rare and valuable trees. After examining photos of the black pine and the other two, he offered an estimate of the decreased value post-pruning. It was painful to see in writing how my once magnificent pine might be compromised for years to come. But the official appraisal gave me a concrete dollar figure. With every new piece of evidence, I felt a surge of resolve. Linda had done more than just break a petty rule. She'd committed an act of genuine harm. I'd see to it that she'd be held accountable, both within the HOA and potentially in court if necessary. The night of the hearing arrived. The board set it up in the local community center, usually used for monthly HOA gatherings. A few neighbors had gathered, seemingly drawn by curiosity. News of Linda's bonsai intervention had spread like wildfire, sparking debates about HOA overreach and personal privacy. I took a seat at a table near the front, Kayla beside me. Across from us sat Linda Bradford, arms folded, staring stonily ahead. Mark Benson called the meeting to order, explaining that this was a special session to address a serious complaint against a board member. First, they let me speak. I used a laptop to play the footage from my backyard camera, the grainy video showing Linda stealthily clipping branches at dawn. Gasps arose from the small audience. Then I presented the appraisal and the local ordinances. This is not a minor matter, I concluded firmly. She trespassed, she vandalized, and it's caused real harm. Linda's turn came next. She rose, her expression a study in indignation. Yes, I trimmed the bonsai, she admitted, voice quavering with anger. But I did it for the neighborhood's benefit. These plants could be invasive. We have strict guidelines about unapproved species, and a board member interrupted. Linda, these were potted, privately owned bonsai. There's no evidence they're invasive. And they're in a fenced backyard. Linda's mouth twitched. The HOA's landscaping rules give us broad power to ensure compliance and aesthetic harmony. I was merely maintaining consistent standards. The homeowner refused to abide by them. I felt my blood pressure climb. Kayla leaned forward. Could you show us exactly where the HOA guidelines specify that you can enter a backyard, unannounced, and prune personal, potted plants? A faint blush crept over Linda's cheeks. The bylaws allow for property inspections. Mark Benson cleared his throat. Linda, we've reviewed the bylaws. They require written notice and permission from the homeowner unless there's an emergency situation posing immediate threat. This was no emergency, and you certainly didn't have permission. Linda's eyes flicked around the room. Realizing her excuses were flimsy, she changed tack. The homeowner's so-called precious bonsai were unsightly. Anyway, twisted stumps. They don't fit Meadow Glenn's aesthetic. A murmur of disapproval rustled through the audience. It was obvious her argument was unraveling. Grace, the other board member, stepped in. The board has viewed the video, Linda. You entered Eric's backyard at dawn, with no notice, and pruned valuable bonsai that are not regulated by the HOA. This is a major violation. The board discussed the evidence openly. They allowed Linda to speak again, but her defense amounted to repeating that she had done it for the good of the neighborhood. Nobody seemed convinced. After about 20 minutes, they called for a vote on whether Linda had violated HOA bylaws and whether she should face disciplinary action. The motion carried unanimously. Linda was found in violation of multiple provisions. The next question was what sanctions to apply. Mark, looking weary, turned to me. Eric, would you like to request anything specific in terms of restitution or apology? I straightened. I expect Linda to pay for the damage she caused. I have an appraisal, and I want a written apology acknowledging what she did was wrong. Beyond that, it's up to the board. But I also reserve the right to pursue legal action if needed. Kayla whispered. Nicely stated. Mark nodded. We respect that. We'd like to avoid a lawsuit if possible. The board can impose fines on Linda for her misconduct, but we can't directly force her to pay you unless you pursue this in civil court. However, I'm strongly urging her to settle with you privately to make amends. Linda's face burned crimson. She opened her mouth to protest, but the board promptly ended the hearing. She shot me a venomous glare as people began filing out. Word spread quickly that Linda was not only officially censured, but might face personal liability for damaging my bonsai. The next day, I received an email from Mark with a formal statement from the HOA. Linda's privileges were suspended, meaning she could no longer act in any official capacity for a specified period. The statement clarified that the board strongly recommended she pay for my repairs and losses. About a week later, Linda herself appeared at my front door, grudgingly. It was late afternoon, the sun setting behind her, casting an orange glow on her tense face. She held a letter. I was told to deliver this, she said tersely. I took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a short, perfunctory apology, acknowledging she'd pruned my bonsai without permission and caused damage. It included a commitment to compensate me for the cost of repairs, as appraised by Mr. Walters, the bonsai expert. She cleared her throat. I hope this resolves everything. Her tone was stiff, her eyes defiant, but there was also a hint of shame. I realized this was probably a huge blow to her pride. She'd lorded over the neighborhood for so long, certain of her authority, only to be rebuked by the very organization she served. I gave a nod. I appreciate the apology, Linda. The check should be made out to me for the amount we discussed. Once I confirm it clears, we'll consider the matter settled. She grimaced, clearly hating every second of this. Without another word, she turned and hurried away. The check arrived a few days later. I deposited it, and indeed it cleared. While no amount of money could fully restore my bonsai to its pre-pruned glory overnight, it would at least cover specialized care and consultation from Mr. Walters. The black pine might eventually recover some of its shape with years of meticulous work. Meanwhile, Linda's iron grip on the community's landscaping choices loosened considerably. With her suspension from the board, she lost the ability to hand out citations or demand compliance with her personal whims. Many neighbors seemed relieved, recounting stories of her nitpicking and intimidation. I felt a wave of vindication, but also a lingering sadness about my bonsai. I'd invested a decade into shaping that tree, and it would take more years to correct the clumsy butchery Linda had inflicted in 5 minutes. Still, the outcome was a victory for personal property rights. The HOA had recognized Linda's wrongdoing, and she was forced to bear the financial consequences. Over the ensuing months, I carefully tended my bonsai, giving them every advantage to recover. My black pine's trunk remained strong, but the canopy was uneven. With Mr. Walters' guidance, I pruned away damaged stubs, sealed wounds, and fed the tree specialized nutrients to stimulate healthy backbudding. In the best-case scenario, small branches might sprout from old wood, allowing me to reshape the silhouette. It was a slow process, but bonsai cultivation had taught me patience long ago. A surprising upswing occurred in the neighborhood's camaraderie. Freed from Linda's overbearing presence, neighbors felt more at ease comparing gardening tips, trading seeds, and discussing landscaping in a friendlier tone. I found myself invited to more casual get-togethers. People even asked about my bonsai, curious to learn how I was rehabilitating them. One afternoon, Jenny and Rob next door invited me for a backyard barbecue. I discovered they had a modest vegetable garden and were eager to show it off without fear of Linda showing up to critique the plant spacing. We chatted, ate burgers, and a sense of normalcy settled over the block. In quieter moments, I pondered what drove Linda's intense need to dominate the community's landscaping. Perhaps it was a power trip, an outlet for controlling an environment down to the smallest detail. HOAs attract personalities like hers, who relish the authority to impose rigid standards. but rarely do they go so far as to physically trespass and damage someone else's property. Regardless, the key lesson was clear. Even in a place where rules and uniformity reign, private rights can't be trampled so easily. And while it took a stressful confrontation, the system, backed by law, did eventually hold Linda accountable. Linda kept a low profile after her censure. Occasionally, I spotted her power walking through the neighborhood, but she never stopped to chat or take notes on landscaping. Some neighbors said she'd apologized to them, too, for her past overreach. Others claimed she was gearing up to move. I had no confirmation, nor did I particularly care. My yard flourished. The oak in the back provided a gentle canopy of shade, while the bonsai bench became a tranquil corner of living art. I spent weekends experimenting with new species, junipers, Chinese elms, even a small wisteria I hoped to train into a cascading style. Each new addition reminded me that a home can be a place of personal expression, not just a sterile facade in line with an HOA's cookie-cutter vision. One crisp autumn day, I was raking leaves in my front yard when Linda approached. Her posture was less rigid than usual, her expression subdued. She offered a hesitant half-smile, then nodded at the rake. "Yard work, huh?" I nodded warily. "Yeah. The oak out back has been shedding leaves nonstop." She scuffed her shoe on the sidewalk. Just wanted to say again. I'm sorry about your bonsai. I shouldn't have done what I did." I paused, leaning on the rake. "Well, I appreciate the acknowledgement." Months had passed since the hearing, and the sting had softened, though not disappeared. "You know," I ventured, "you really damaged them, especially the black pine. It's taken a lot of work to nurse it back." She nodded once, looking genuinely contrite. "I've read up on bonsai since then. Didn't realize how delicate and time-intensive they are." Her gaze shifted to the ground. "Anyway, hope you can rebuild it. Guess I learned my lesson." It was an unexpectedly sincere moment. I replied, "Thank you. I hope so too." Without further comment, she turned and walked away. I exhaled, unsure how to feel, part pity, part lingering resentment. But it seemed she'd found some humility in the face of her mistake. I placed a mental bookmark on that conversation, acknowledging that while we'd never be friends, at least the conflict was over. Time rolled on. The next HOA election cycle came and went, and Linda Bradford did not run for re-election. A younger couple, more community-minded, took over the landscaping committee. They introduced flexible guidelines for front yard planting, and while the official species were still recommended, they allowed greater personal choice and creativity. It felt like a breath of fresh air. My black pine slowly started sprouting buds in areas close to the trunk, a promising sign that I might, in 2 or 3 years, shape new branches. The wisteria bonsai grew luscious blooms every spring, enchanting anyone who visited. Even the smaller Shishigashara maple, which Linda had also pruned, recovered enough that its foliage looked full and vibrant. In the end, I came to appreciate the valuable time and patience bonsai demanded, even in the face of damage. Their resilience served as a metaphor for the neighborhood itself. Though battered by conflicts and controlling personalities, it eventually bounced back. People connected more, found common ground, and recognized that a little personal expression wouldn't destroy the so-called cohesive look. Months later, I invited Doug, Candace, and a few other neighbors for a small backyard gathering. Over snacks and iced tea, we reminisced about the Linda era. The conversation had a bemused, almost comedic tone, like remembering a villain from a movie who was finally vanquished. "Remember how she measured the distance between my stepping stones, insisting they had to be equidistant?" Doug said, rolling his eyes. Candace added, "She told me to remove my wind chimes because they didn't match the neighborhood's auditory environment." I swear I'm not making that up. I laughed along, though a part of me still mourned the irreparable branches of my black pine. Yet the memory no longer stung quite as much. Instead, I felt relief that the community had collectively stood against such overreach. As twilight fell, I showed them the progress my bonsai had made. Even under the soft glow of my patio lanterns, one could see buds along the pine's trunk. "Next season, these might develop into decent branches," I said, a hopeful note in my voice. Candace admired the tree. "It's beautiful. I'd never guess it went through that kind of damage." "In time," I murmured, gently touching the trunk. Bonsai are patient creatures. They adapt. Over the following year, the neighborhood steadily evolved. The new HOA board proved more flexible, focusing on actual community improvements rather than policing minor deviations in landscaping. A small community garden was introduced near the entrance, giving residents a place to grow vegetables and flowers. People shared tips on everything from composting to flower arrangements. The old uniform lines of ornamental pear trees began to intermingle with new species, redbuds, magnolias, and maples, each yard reflecting a bit of the homeowner's personality. Interestingly, those changes didn't reduce the overall appeal or property values. If anything, the neighborhood looked more vibrant, more welcoming. Homebuyers were drawn to the friendlier vibe, and housing prices remained stable. It turned out that cohesive didn't have to mean constrictive. Occasionally, a neighbor would privately thank me for standing up to Linda. It was the turning point, someone told me once. When she got caught pruning your bonsai, we all realized we didn't have to tolerate that kind of bullying. One day, while chatting with Mr. Walters at his bonsai nursery, I learned that Linda had reached out to him after the incident. She'd asked for advice on which ornamental trees to plant in her own yard, apparently wanting to ensure full compliance for herself. Though Mr. Walters didn't mention her attitude one way or another, I found it telling that she was now seeking guidance rather than imposing her will on others. Sometimes people learn the hard way, he remarked, shrugging. At least she's trying to do it correctly now. He didn't elaborate further, respecting customer privacy, but I appreciated the irony. Linda, who had once forced everyone else to adopt official species, was now timidly navigating her own yard's rules. Eventually, spring arrived again. My black pine produced fresh candles, new growth tips bursting with bright needles. I carefully pinched them back, shaping them in a way to encourage lateral branching. More buds appeared in unexpected places. Thanks to the professional help I'd funded with Linda's check, the tree was beginning a slow but hopeful transformation. One day, I stood before my bonsai bench, letting the morning sun warm my shoulders, marveling at how nature finds ways to recover. I thought of Linda's stealthy attack, her desire to force uniformity, no matter the personal cost to others. Yet the bonsai endured, just as I had, reclaiming its beauty branch by branch. A single question often flickered in my mind. Did Linda truly understand the gravity of her mistake? Perhaps it was enough that she faced consequences, financially and socially. In a small community like Meadow Glenn, reputations linger. People might forgive, but they rarely forget. She'd learned a pricey lesson in humility, one that, hopefully, might curb her zeal for controlling others. 2 years later, the black pine stands as a testament to resilience. Its trunk remains thick and gnarled, a sign of age and character. New branches have sprouted, carefully wired and guided into pleasing curves. It's not exactly the same shape it once was. Some scars remain where Linda hacked off branches, but it's still alive and thriving, with its own unique beauty. The rest of my bonsai collection flourished as well. Some neighbors caught the bug, exploring bonsai workshops and even starting their own miniature forests. The once tense climate under Linda's rule faded into a more relaxed communal spirit. I occasionally see Linda around town. She doesn't avoid me, but neither does she linger for conversation. We exchange cordial nods, an unspoken agreement to let the past remain in the past. I suspect she's discovered there's far more joy in cultivating what one loves rather than tearing down what one doesn't. Looking back, I'm grateful for the small but meaningful victory that came out of a petty act of vandalism. My bonsai's slow regrowth mirrored the neighborhood's slow shift away from authoritarian uniformity toward a more welcoming variety of plants and personalities. In the end, the moral is simple: nature thrives on diversity, and so do communities. Imposing strict sameness might offer superficial neatness, but it kills creativity and personal expression. When a so-called Karen overstepped her bounds, we fought back, restoring balance, not just for my bonsai, but for Meadow Glen as a whole.